Howdy, everybody. My name is Grace Inesca, and today I'll be discussing the negative effects of copper and cadmium exposure on honeybee development, specifically digging a little bit deeper into the effects on weight, mortality, and development time. So, like we've all heard way too many times before about saving the bees, why do we care so much? Well, honeybees play a crucial role in pollinating various crops and maintaining ecological balance across many diverse ecosystems. Apis mellifera, specifically, as we know, is widely distributed. So, this makes them a key species across the globe, offering a lot of economic value through agricultural yields. Because they're so widely distributed, they also act as integral health indicators by providing insight into the health of the ecosystems that they forage. However, honeybee health has increasingly been compromised by heavy metals, particularly copper and cadmium, which are becoming way more prevalent in the environment. Because of increased populations, the use of fertilizer and industrial activity have also greatly increased, which has caused public and environmental health implications across the board. And although anthropogenic activities have exacerbated this contamination issue, it's not the sole cause. So there are natural sources of metal that occur in the environment, like this figure represents. So whether that be weathering of rocks, erosion, metals entering the water and the soil, etc. Because both anthropogenic and natural pathways, honeybees are exposed to heavy metals through several ways. This can include foraging in contaminated environments, through ingesting metals from airborne pollutants such as particulate matter, foraging in water sources of polluted bodies of water, and through soil, which we'll talk a little bit more later. But in terms of their diet, well, honeybees are particularly vulnerable since metals can end up in pollen and in nectar. So how does this occur? Well, the metals leach into the soil and get absorbed through the plant's roots. They then transport the metals through their vascular systems into their reproductive structures, which, as we all know, is where bees forage from. So, how does metal accumulate in honeybees? Well, heavy metals integrate inside of the hive as well. So, for instance, studies found that cadmium accumulated more than other metals in beeswax, which poses a risk for bees and humans because we also are consuming bee products. Similarly, they found that cadmium and copper together were both found in honey products. But what I think is the most concerning is that for the development of honeybees is that researchers found an extremely large amount of metals in royal jelly, which we know is the main source that feeds larval bees. So you may be asking if honeybees have a mechanism for extracting these heavy metals from themselves, similar to that of other organisms. And the answer is yes and no at the same time. So, one study found that in low concentrations, the honeybees did relatively well, removing about 50% of the cadmium. However, they found that there was a synergistic effect that when there were higher thresholds of cadmium, their ability to remove the metals decreased, and it also resulted in smaller body mass due to that increased exposure. So, honeybee development. Why is this important? Honeybees undergo several integral and very sensitive developmental stages. They can be split, namely, into three parts. So, the larval, the prepupal, and the pupal stages. The larval and early prepupal, excuse me, are particularly sensitive to environmental factors such as metals. So, research has deducted that the exposure to both copper and cadmium has been very dangerous in developmenting bees because it's affecting key processes. One of these key processes is caste determination. So, as we said, the diet of royal jelly is contaminated with metal and influences whether female larvae can develop into workers or queens. So, the increased metal in this may skew this very crucial process. Another issue involves immunity development. So, the research also indicated that the exposure can lead to molecular changes in the individual, impairing the formation of a honeybee's immune system. This can make them more susceptible to disease. And as we've already talked about, it's not going to only affect on the individual level when it comes to the immune system, but rather the colony as a whole. Finally, growth development. These honeybees undergo significant molecular changes at the larval stage, so heavy metal exposure can greatly affect the prepupal and pupal growth and development time. So, what is our specific research question? We wanted to figure out how does the exposure to copper and cadmium affect honeybee development during larval, prepupal, and pupal stages. So, these are the main three results, but let's go ahead and take a little bit of a closer look. So, this graph right here shows the larval growth index when exposed to metals, where higher levels resulted in impaired growth and slowed development. So, this green circle right here at the top demonstrates the lesser levels of metals versus this red circle over here that shows what happens with higher levels. This second graph demonstrates the mortality rates between contaminated and controlled diets. So, as you can see here in the key, higher levels had increased mortality rates. The green circle is showing that the least amount of mortalities were associated with the zero metal exposure. However, this red circle demonstrates that with the increased exposure, there's going to be an associated increased mortality. Finally, prepupal and pupal weights were recorded as well, and they found that although cadmium alone had no statistical significance on affecting prepupal weights, they found that copper had significant effects on both the prepupal and pupal weights. So, to conclude, elevated levels of copper and cadmium resulted in decreased larval, prepupal, and pupal growth indices, along with significantly increased mortality rates during development. However, research did actually find a difference in the effect between these two metals. What they found is that cadmium had a more negatively acute effect than copper. So, for example, the research showed that exposure to cadmium led to rapid mortality. So, by day 4, there was a 100% death rate. And then when they compared this to that of copper, the copper had a much slower trend. So, by day 10, it only accumulated about a 92% death rate. Overall, these findings underscore the seriousness of heavy metal exposure, especially how individual metals affect these areas. But it also highlights that the effect of combined exposure of different metals. So, because of this, all the research articles pointed out that there should be future studies conducting to better understand how combined effects of these metals can affect other facets of life, such as behavioral impacts and foraging. Ultimately, the implications of this study extend beyond the individual honeybee, as we all know in the superorganism. It's extended to entire colonies. Perhaps it could hurt populations and even entire species of bees. So, this will have cascading effects on our ability to provide sufficient agricultural health and food security, biodiversity, and productivity. Because of that, it is imperative that we increase research efforts and awareness around environmental contaminants that threaten our pollinators' health. Thank you so much for your attention. I'll be happy to answer any questions, and I hope you have a fantastic day.